Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and hello everybody. My name is Amir and I am here to talk about what had happened over the past week. I apologize for my absence. Had an unexpected medical I had an unexpected medical emergency when I had pulled my back muscle last week's Wednesday. But I am back now. I had been keeping up with political developments during my recovery, and I feel fit now to sit down and record this latest episode. This does mean, however, that the information I will now describe is a week old, but that will still prove to be important, as right now many of you might have heard of Makkah the Makkah Joint Defense Agreement. As of now, there is little to no information about it. So, in the meantime, I have decided to go on with what would have been slightly older news. Old but nonetheless relevant. I will start with something President Donald has only, as far as I could tell, stated once: the Eurasian Axis. Now, as many of us know, President Donald is not exactly the sharpest knife in the drawer when it comes to international politics. The Eurasian Axis, of course, is not his own invention. As Pepe Escobar stated, the Eurasian Axis is probably an invention of Elbridge Colby. And Pepe also stressed that it could not be just BRICS because BRICS itself is a geo-economic forum, and Russia and China do not want to turn it into a military alliance. The SCO is closer to a military organization, but once again is not an alliance, as currently it handles geoeconomics along with its initial goal of counterterrorism. And if Russia and China do turn the SCO into a military alliance, the US will cite it as a provocation. Both organizations are also plagued by India and the UAE's actions against other member and prospective member states. In India's case, it is against Pakistan, and in the UAE's case, it is against fellow BRICS member state Iran. It should also be remembered that the UAE is facing stiff resistance in its ambitions from Saudi Arabia too. The UAE had earlier left OPEC on its own, and Saudi Arabia proceeded to bomb it in retaliation, targeting, I believe, if I remember correctly, oil Emirati oil wells. I also would like to state that whilst Eurasian Axis might have a somewhat ambiguous meaning, it is clear nonetheless that it is a confirmation that the US is trying to reinforce its hegemony upon Eurasia itself, and it sees BRICS and the SCO as getting in the way. Emerging organizations like Iran's Persian Gulf Strait Authority and the CSTO, which played a pivotal role in securing Kazakhstan during its 2020 coup attempt, are also important, as they have enforced Eurasian stability in the face of American hegemony. I would also like to add that at the time, MoU resuscitation efforts were ongoing but had little to no effect. Nevertheless, China's Minister of Foreign Affairs Wang Yi epitomized epitomized Pakistan's efforts in mediation, and he stressed that all parties must return to the MoU. This, of course, is a subtle jab at the US, much like how the Chinese typically, much in the vein of how the Chinese typically do their diplomacy. China also called upon improving relations between countries that straddle the Persian Gulf. China can do this because it has friendly relations with all GCC member states, and it does not play favorites when it comes to oil imports. It called on them to reconsider their collective security arrangements. This, of course, is China asking the GCC to reassess their security arrangements with the US. Security arrangements that have proven counterproductive, as no as no Patriot missile systems managed to hit their targets in the defense of US in the defense of US base in the defense of US bases, or in the case of Saudi Arabia, even Saudi oil installations, going back all the way to the Yemeni civil war. And we will, if we have time, return to Yemen. But before I do that, I would also like to emphasize that Pepe Escobar confirmed that Iran continues to have the initiative, both on the battlefield and at the negotiating table. Iran posits that it should keep control of the Strait of Hormuz, that the US must cease its own blockade and return to the MoU. Only then will Iran discuss its nuclear capabilities. The US, of course, has no option but to accept these terms, as any other alternatives are already dead on arrival. Pepe also explained that Pakistan's Minister of the Interior and Narcotics Control, Mohsin Naqvi, visited Iran carrying communiques from Field Marshal Asim Munir to Grand Ayatollah Mojtaba Khamenei. He also Minister Mohsin Naqvi also met with Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, among others. And there was also an important meeting between Field Marshal Asim Munir and US officials in Rawalpindi, at military headquarters in Rawalpindi. Currently, at the time and at this moment as well, it is unknown who the American architect of this new diplomatic overture is. What we do know is that Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner were not part of the diplomatic mission, and that is an important reason why Field Marshal Asim would have met up with the mission, as it indicates that these are, at least relatively, much more serious players. What they discussed and what came of the meeting is unknown at this time. What could be, what is known is that Pepe confirmed that the US was planning to move negotiations further west by changing the venues towards presumably Switzerland. Iran could settle for Doha, but it prefers Islamabad, and both Pakistan and Iran remain wary of any Mossad assassination attempts, like they had experienced in Burgenstock and the ones prior. I would also like to confirm, and this remains true at this moment in time as well, that Larry Johnson noted that there will be no new airstrikes on Iran because MacDill Air Force Base, CENTCOM's headquarters, and Shaw Air Force Base's Air Force Central AFCENT, which is the Air Command component of CENTCOM and the successor to the Combined Air Operations Center (CAOC) that was displaced from Al Udeid Air Base, are not communicating for such an event. Currently, both oil and bond markets in the US are experiencing external interventions to rescue them. This is negatively affecting the US stock market. And there are important updates to this relating to the Japanese yen, but we will come to that later on. Now back to Yemen. Larry Larry explains that Saudi Arabia's recent aggression towards Yemen has placed China in a bind. China needs Persian Gulf resources for the global South's ongoing development. Iran is willing to cooperate on this, but the US continues its own blockade on Persian Gulf, jeopardizing security of the cargo ships transiting there. China has backed the SMDA between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia bombed Sana'a International Airport. Ansarallah proceeded to retaliate, and Saudi Arabia announced that it would engage in a ceasefire. Then Ansarallah declared that Saudi cargo ships were barred from transiting the Bab al Mandab. Saudi Arabia retaliated by bombing Al Hudaydah port. Ansarallah retaliated the Saudi Arabian oil company's Jizan oil refinery. The damage could take about 4 months to repair. On this recent escalation against Al Hudaydah, Riyadh remains silent. Through this back and forth, we can see, and many who have witnessed the Yemeni civil war can confirm, there is no military solution to this conflict, only a diplomatic one, and it is very much similar to the quagmire the US is trapped in. Both the US and Saudi Arabia cannot escalate against their rivals and achieve their goals or even objectives. They do not have the means, nor the political will, nor the allies to carry on. Excuse me. And yet they continue to do so, to their own disadvantage. Eventually, reality and their own deteriorating domestic circumstances will compel them to forge a diplomatic solution. But time is running out for both of them. And in that vein, we also have ongoing false flags, as Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson explained that Ansarallah could not have hit the second oil refinery in Saudi Arabia because they would have announced it. The Iraqi resistance also denied any responsibility. He postulates, and I agree, that another group within Saudi Arabia may be trying to rise up against the House of Saud, something akin to the Arab Spring uprising. only this time in Saudi Arabia itself. Anyone who had listened to Pepe Escobar's recent programs would have noted that Saudi Arabia itself had and continues to maintain itself using a clan-based system, and the thousand or so clans are only weakly held together in a confederation under the House of Saud, a confederation glued together by public by public services and a military which is fueled through oil, through at first the oil wealth of Saudi Arabia and later on the petrodollar. But the but the current blockade, the current US blockade on the Persian Gulf, the current blockade in the Persian Gulf, the PGSA's enforcement of fees and fines for all ships transiting through the Strait of Hormuz, and now the Bab al-Mandab block, and now a blockade, and now Ansarallah's Bab al-Mandab blockade have currently reduced Saudi Arabia's oil exports to zero for the first time in history. And this is very likely to continue. There is no sign that Ansarallah will release its blockade. Similarly, there is little to no sign that the US will release its own blockade and return to the MoU, even though it is entirely in the US's own interests to receive this oil. It does not have the resources to continue it does not have the resources to maintain its own domestic consumption. It has not undergone any rationing, and the oil wealth from Venezuela, which is a mere 800,000 it is a mere 800,000 barrels per day, if I remember correctly, is not nearly enough to sustain the US's consumption. I also want to speak about the deal of a Saudi Arabian nuclear program. Colonel Lawrence explained that the US is hardly a country capable of nuclear industry. In the last 26 years, the US has only built 2 nuclear power plants, one of which was 30 years overdue and over budget. Meanwhile, Russia, through this same time, built about 60, and China even more. They continue to export this technology too. But the US demands that if Saudi Arabia wants a nuclear power plant, it must sign the long dead Abraham Accords, no doubt a plan to revive and lend legitimacy to them. And yet Russia and China pose no such restrictions. All this, of course, is a sign that the US continues to maintain its hegemony even when Saudi Arabia is in dire straits, and it would benefit the US in the long term, as energy independence would allow Saudi Arabia to diversify its economy and continue to maintain the oil all while maintaining oil as its key export. The money, of course, would would enter the US market. It would reinforce US stock and bond markets. However, the US has opted for more short-term solutions. solutions that will not solutions that have simply come too little too late. The Abraham Accords, of course, are long dead. There have been no new signees for years now, and it is very unlikely that Saudi Arabia would sign it, as it itself had proposed to, as it itself has stated in various times that it stood up, at least nominally, for a Palestinian state, but only just that. The Abraham Accords, of course, would run counter if Saudi Arabia signed, and if it did sign, it would no doubt cause chaos across Saudi Arabia, as the public backlash would be vehement, as the public backlash would be possibly unprecedented in Saudi Arabia's history. All the while, Saudi Arabia's economy continues to decline. And if we have enough time, I will get to just what Saudi Arabia is doing to tackle it. Of course, these plans are simply too little too late. The nuclear program, of course, is one of these plans that is one of such plans. I also want to mention another similarity between the quagmires both Saudi Arabia and the US are currently involved in. And this time, from the perspective of both Iran and Yemen. Colonel Jacques Boad explained that both Iran and Yemen are locked in an existential conflict. They have nothing to lose. This enables them to escalate the conflict dauntlessly, and it compels the US and Saudi Arabia to escalate. Both, of course, cannot conventionally escalate by much. There is also the important matter of understanding and accepting loss, given how as understanding and accepting losses during wartime, as Iran and Yemen both have cultures whereby accepting casualties is a central norm. Excuse me. Both Iran and Ansarullah and the Yemeni armed forces have already absorbed multiple civilian casualties in the thousands. Same with Hezbollah and Hamas. Israel, the US, and Saudi Arabia have combined lost much fewer, and yet these three believe that they have lost much more. Israel, much like the US, and I would argue Saudi Arabia, cannot comprehend just how the enemy thinks. They frequently underestimate them, and it is these underestimations that have led to various defeats. It is also these various underestimations that led to such serious such seriously disastrous misadventures in the first place. The US previously had never gone to war directly with Iran, yet under President Donald John we have the second imposed war. Israel Israel's faulty intelligence analysis would later on would lead to the July War, also known as the 2006 Lebanon War. Later on, it would lead to the retaliation against Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, later on, which is now known as the Palestinian Holocaust. And Saudi Arabia, possibly believing that it had the upper hand in negotiations, possibly under US pressure, bombed Sana'a International Airport, just as Yemeni diplomats were returning from mourning the from mourning from from paying their respects to Grand Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and his family. All of these defeats and all of these misadventures stem from the same issue. They do not understand nor accept the enemy as they are. Even labeling their various enemies as enemies is already a fallacy. As Israel continues to pick enemies, it will continue to destabilize not only the region but its own security and socio-economic prospects. Saudi Arabia is already facing this, and the US is experiencing one at a global scale, as it no longer has the capability to import much needed sulfurous crude oil that is needed to power its already minuscule industry. I also do want to go into the issue of Kolang Mountain. Previously it was called Previously I had mistakenly called it Pickaxe Mountain, but it turns out that the real name is Kolang Mountain. To me, this has never happened before. Geographical features are always called by their native names. Major Scott Ritter confirmed that President Donald is trying to use the Kolang Mountains to justify the use of nuclear weapons on Iran in a non-nuclear environment. If the US goes forward with this, it will compel Russia to rethink its own nuclear posture, which is premised around MAD, mutually assured destruction, to one that maintains nuclear parity with the US. That would imply that Russia launches its own nuclear weapons at a US proxy, possibly a NATO member state, to preserve this nuclear parity. And Colonel Jacques questions how the US could ever seize Kolang Mountain, as it would force the US into a conflict with Iran, something that Israel does want, but it would be an expansion of the Second Imposed War at a time when the US does not have the means, in the sense of both weapons and manpower, when it lacks the political will, given that the Second Imposed War was from day one quite unpopular. If I remember correctly, only 35% of all Americans supported President Donald John's latest crusade against Iran. But this is still a very important moment. If the US, as Major Scott Ritter confirms, does go ahead, it would no doubt create a pretext for a new arms race, a nuclear arms race in an environment where Previous nuclear treaties have already fallen through. The ABM Treaty have been the US abandoned the ABM Treaty in 2002, and the INF Treaty was abandoned, and the US abandoned the INF Treaty in 2019, both of which had limited the scale and deployment of various nuclear weapons. But without these, the US can easily escalate without any restrictions. The US can escalate without any restrictions. And finally, there is also Ukraine. There is also Ukraine's recent gambit when it sought to enter the second imposed war by attacking an Iranian cargo ship in the Caspian Sea. Colonel Jack Bott explains that Ukraine's behavior is similar to Israel's. Both seek to expand the damage they can cause by attacking new countries and factions. There were many false flag attacks via drones against both Poland and Romania to involve them in the SMO when Ukraine's situation as Ukraine's situation degraded. Ukraine taking on Iran by attacking an Iranian cargo ship in the Caspian Sea is a sycophantic way of it showing support for the US, and Larry Johnson agrees with this. This also explains why Chairman of the Iraqi National Security Council, the INSC, Qasim al-Aboudi, stated that Ukrainian cells are operating in Iraq and plan to attack Iraqi installations via false flag attacks. Colonel Jacques also reminds us that Ukrainian units also supported Ahmed al-Julani Hussein as he broke out of Idlib governorate, and Ukraine also supported the jihadists in Mali that acted against the Malian government and Russia to France's benefit. All of this is Ukraine's international gambit. It is emblematic of nations that have deteriorating prognoses domestically, not just internationally. Both Ukraine and Israel face social unrest and economic decline, which makes them desperate to seek out any semblance of success. Said success contributes to the ruling party's legitimacy. But despite this Ukrainian escalation, he remains confident in Iran's rational strategy and how it applies its response and how it would respond. When Ukraine attacked Iran, Ukraine, much like Israel and Saudi Arabia and the US, much like Ukraine, Saudi Arabia and the US, underestimated Iran's capabilities. And I would also like to add that later on, Ukraine had apologized for this incident. Evidently, someone had gotten to President Volodymyr Zelensky and persuaded him to roll back the attack. Iran accepted the apology and had never launched an attack on Ukraine. Colonel Jacques also explained that all this is also a symptom of how counterterrorism had has has dominated strategic thinking in Western countries. And by dominating strategic thinking, he of course means that it erased strategic thinking, as counterterrorism does not require much strategic planning. But such Cold War, such legacies of the Cold War remain intact in Russia, Iran, and Yemen. And it is these countries that define the flow of conflict. They also have missiles and combine them with other operational and tactical capabilities. And I would add a strategic plan for bettering their own uh, national situations. All these all these combined would create a most formidable opponent, an opponent the West has never faced before. Previously, during the Cold War, it had previously fought against more it had previously fought against less technologically sophisticated nations, such as North Vietnam and to a degree the DPRK. But when it came to a more symmetrical challenge, as it is facing now, the US had long since the US had long since lost any strategic thinking or even capability, given how its own industrial decline has contributed to the lack of munitions and the lack of technological advancement. I am certain many of you have heard of how of how Andre Martiano continues to confirm that the US's table of organization of and equipment TOE, which is an important building block for for any military formations, an important building block in any US military formation, as it tables the various units' equipment and manpower, has remained stuck in the 1990s. All the while, Russia, China, and Iran have upgraded their systems. Whether domestically or with some international cooperation. And as for the SMO, Larry explains that Russia is taking the gloves off. Russian presidential spokesman Dmitry Peskov had repeatedly announced that the SMO is now a war against Europe. After the announcement, Russian missile strikes against Kiev and other cities increased. Russia has also closed off Odessa and by extension Nikolaev to all marine traffic, with no exceptions. Odessa, of course, is Ukraine's only remaining major port in the Black Sea. Russian ground forces, he asserts, are now moving much more quickly as of late. The Russian population, in his opinion, will vehemently oppose any politician who postulates anything except revenge in the upcoming Russian legislative elections in September, as the populace seeks Ukraine's disarmament in the face of repeated terror attacks using drones. He explains that bringing the SMO and the second imposed war together has exposed the US's shortage in missiles that both Israel and Ukraine need. Now, of course, the latter point has been stated many times and still is important, but it is the former that I would like to focus on. Russia is picking up the pace. Typically, if one had looked at the history of the SMO, it usually does pick up the pace every late summer. And now Russia Russia looks like it is poised to do just that. The last pocket of resistance in Donetsk Oblast the is now the is now the last Ukraine's last bastion in Donetsk Oblast is about to be is currently encircled and is currently being encircled. And unlike previous times, Kiev and other cities are now being hit. This, of course, means that Russia will be continuing its advance further on. All the while, Western sanctions have played essentially no role in limiting this pace. If anything, Russia has turned towards both itself and the East for economic sustenance has only bolstered its capabilities. We could be seeing the end of the SMO quite soon, as Ukraine is facing fewer and fewer, as Ukraine experiences more and more declines in both manpower and equipment. The US has not exactly walked away from the SMO, but has kept political support, but has placed Ukraine in the back seat, at least when in terms of official political support. But this does not mean that the US has left the SMO. Indeed, Ukraine can only attack Russia's rear can only attack Russia's strategic rear due to US targeting. All the while, the US has been experiencing severe energy concerns. As Larry explained, the US stores its strategic reserves in salt caverns, meaning that about 20% or 140 million barrels must stay in the caverns. Otherwise, water could quickly flood the cavern, dissolve the salt, and collapse the cavern. Recently, at least at the time of this information, last week, the US's Department of Energy had announced that it was going to reduce this limit from 20% to 10% or 70 million barrels. This is, of course, indicative of the desperate situation the US is facing and will no doubt contribute to the weakening, if not the outright destruction, of these salt caverns. If this does happen, the US will quickly find that it will have no place to store any oil at all. These naturally occurring caverns can only be maintained as long as there is enough oil to keep the water out. But if the Department of Energy is cutting back even there, then it is no doubt another proof of the US's inability to grapple with an all-consuming crisis, a crisis that continues to go on unreported in mainstream media. That is enough of a catch up for today. I have more planned for this subject. I have more planned for this subject as I catch up. Thank you very much for listening. I hope my absence has not been too I hope my absence has not been too severely limiting. Thank you very much once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you in the comments. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I shall see you all in the next video. Goodbye.